Censorship kills. It literally is antithetical to public health.
You have called coronavirus the new terrorism.
Nobody wants to see a dictatorship built over their head.
This week, Conflict Zone has a different look. And in these extraordinary times, we decided to take the opportunity to focus on the impact that the coronavirus pandemic is having on human rights. Around the world, there are reports of invasive surveillance, authoritarian power grabs, and society's most vulnerable facing hunger. My guest is the head of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth. With the UN warning the public health emergency is quickly becoming a human rights crisis, how many limitations are people willing to accept in order to fight a threat like coronavirus? Kenneth Roth, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thanks for having me.
There are very immediate needs amid this coronavirus pandemic. Hundreds of thousands have already died. Economies have been hit hard. Many people are losing their jobs. Some are even trying to figure out how to put food on the table. In these extraordinary times, how do you put human rights at the top of the agenda?
Well, I think it's important, Sarah, to note that human rights allow certain extraordinary governmental powers in time of a genuine public emergency or crisis like we're facing now. So, nobody objects from a human rights perspective to the efforts to limit our travel, to enforce social distancing, to do the things that are necessary and proportionate to our public health needs. But when autocrats say, oh, we need to just violate your human rights left and right in order to protect you, that's a very dangerous message. It's wrong not only as a matter of principle, but it actually undermines our public health. And that's something that Human Rights Watch has been finding over and over, that when autocrats censor or grab power or take various other steps that are antithetical to human rights, it actually puts us in a worse place in public health terms.
You mentioned autocrats there, and I'd like to bring you to what the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights said. She said the following: we could have a parallel epidemic of authoritarian and repressive measures following close, if not on the heels of this health epidemic. How big is that threat?
I think the threat is absolutely real. I mean, I think back to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. And there are many parallels to that time and today. In each case, there was a genuine threat to public safety. People called on their governments to protect them. And what we saw then is, many governments overreached. In the name of protection, they completely undermined human rights in ways that didn't make us any safer. So, it was hard then to roll back some of those steps. Today, if you look at the United States, we still have Guantanamo. The Bush CIA torturers were never prosecuted. We still have large portions of the surveillance state that the National Security Agency created. We still have killing by targeted, by drones, targeted killing by them. So, these are the kinds of threats that we could face today. But the flip side is that, frankly, this is also an opportunity to show that respect for human rights is essential to an effective public health strategy. And let me give an example going to the origins of this pandemic. If we look at what the Chinese government did in Wuhan at the outbreak of the epidemic, they censored rather than heeded the handful of doctors who tried to sound the alarm. They said, look, we don't know what's happening, but there is a new lethal threat out there. They called it a SARS-like coronavirus. And what the Chinese authorities did is, rather than listen to them, rather than act, they suppressed them because this was the kind of bad news that Beijing doesn't like to hear. There was a recent study by the University of Southampton that, if those 3 weeks had not been wasted, 3 weeks during which literally millions of people traveled through Wuhan, left Wuhan, when the virus really went global, if not for those wasted 3 weeks, by the end of February, the prevalence of the virus would have been 95% less than it was. So that just shows that censorship kills. It literally is antithetical to public health.
And I want to get to more of that censorship and especially the Chinese handling of the crisis. But I want to continue first with the authoritarian power grab that you mentioned, for example, in Hungary, and ask you, because Hungary's Secretary of International Communication actually attacked you, Zoltán Kovács, saying the following: while the director of Human Rights Watch gazes at his navel in Geneva, fretting about authoritarian rot, the Hungarian people look for a steady hand at the rudder to navigate this storm. Doesn't he have a point?
I mean, au contraire. I mean, that's just the rhetoric he gives. I mean, what Viktor Orban, the prime minister in Hungary, has done is use this coronavirus to create the European Union's first dictatorship. He has the power now to rule by decree, to sideline parliament. There is no need for another election ever until parliament approves that and his party controls parliament. This is a dictatorship, pure and simple. And so, let's look how that dictatorship is doing. Human Rights Watch has been in the process of studying Hungarian hospitals. And what we found is that while Orban takes the very generous stabilization funds provided by the European Union and uses them to build football stadiums to pay off his cronies, I mean, quite literally, the hospitals are a disaster. People need to bring their own toilet paper. People are being, thrown out on the street because they're not currently a coronavirus patient.
Right.
They are, this illustrates what happens when you have an unaccountable government. And that's what Viktor Orban is.
So if you're right,
look,
if you're right, Ken, where is the domestic outcry? Because the public overwhelmingly supports these emergency measures.
Well, what emergency measures? In other words, the public overwhelmingly supports social distancing, restrictions on travel. I mean, every democracy in the world is doing that. Of course, that's appropriate. What they don't support is power grabs and censorship and self-serving steps of the sort that Orban did. The most recent indication we have is when there were, municipal, mayoral elections recently, Orban's party lost Budapest and the leading 15 cities. So it's not as if the Hungarian public is happy with this, but Orban has been, censoring the media, undermining the possibility of the courts to check him. When the public is able to speak out, it expresses its disapproval. But nobody wants to see a dictatorship built over their head when that dictatorship, as it always does, serves the political interests of the dictator.
So then what is your strategy to help promote human rights in countries like Hungary when the majority of the population supports these measures? How do you adjust?
Well, again, I mean, I have to differ with you. The majority of the population doesn't support a dictatorship. The population supports the uncontroversial things, social distancing, travel restrictions, of course, but a dictatorship, no. And so what we have been trying to do, for example, with the European Union, is to ask, why does the European Union continue to provide extraordinarily generous subsidies to this Trojan horse within European democracy? Why, for example, does the European People's Party, the center-right alliance in the European Parliament, why does it continue to treat Fidesz, Orban's party, as a member rather than to formally expel it? It suspended it, but it didn't expel it. Why does the European Union's budget continue to provide these? So these are the kinds of things that can be done. But frankly, so far, European political leaders have been quite timid. They issued a so-called protest when Orban established this dictatorship, but they didn't name Hungary. It was just a bland, generic statement of principle. It was so bland that Orban joined it.
So you say it's a question of accountability. It's a question of pressuring Hungary. I want to get to that a little bit later, but first I want to turn to surveillance now. That is another measure that we have seen emerged amid this coronavirus crisis. You have called coronavirus the new terrorism. Through that lens, where is the balance between surveillance and civil liberties right now?
Well, I think what's interesting is what we've seen over the last few weeks as the debate on this topic has evolved is that there's growing recognition that respect for privacy is actually essential for this surveillance to work. And let me explain. The leading option right now being pursued is an app that would be downloaded onto your phone and would use basically Bluetooth technology to see who has been in contact with whom if somebody is infected. And so you would download the app, you turn on your Bluetooth capacity, and if you later are found to have been infected, your phone will have collected any other Bluetooth accessible phone that you were near during the prior 2 weeks, and those people would be notified that they might have been infected and they need to take protective measures. So it's a good idea in principle, but you have to start looking at the fine print. Will the name of the infected person be disclosed? There's really no need for that. Will the location of this meeting be recorded or not? Again, there's no need for that. All you need to know is that you were near someone who's affected. You don't need to know the house or store or whatever where that occurred. Is this going to be stored just for 2 weeks when it's actionable, or is it going to be stored forever? Is it going to be given to the police or not? And what we found is that for people to be willing to download these apps, all those kind of questions have to be answered in a way that respects privacy.
But a lot of those questions haven't been answered yet, Ken. And if we just look at the public opinion, it seems to be in many countries around the world in support of these surveillance measures. I'll look at South Korea, where 77% of South Koreans supported a proposal to require all people subject to a 2-week self-isolation to wear electronic wristbands. And it's not just there. Also, 65% of Britons support government use of mobile phone data. So the question is, the public clearly sees the merits of it. But let's bring it back to the privacy. How high is the risk that people are too open to give up their privacy because they're afraid? They're afraid of this virus.
I think what we're seeing is that as people become aware of the options, they opt for privacy. So yes, they want electronic surveillance to facilitate contact tracing. But for example, the debate is completely moved away.
So they choose privacy over their own health.
No. In other words, the point is that respect for privacy is the best way to protect people's health, because that's how you get the cooperation with public health initiatives that's required. So, for example, you mentioned South Korea. South Korea used location data, which is incredibly intrusive. If you basically will reveal to the public every place you went in the course of the day, you're revealing huge parts about your private life. And indeed, we saw that. South Korea would publicize, so-and-so was in this location, and, secret liaisons would be revealed and the like. It was actually quite horrible. The debate is now completely moved away from location data. The reason we're talking about this Bluetooth technology is because the public so objects to the use of location data.
Okay. So privacy is one issue, but we also have around the world people struggling to get just the basics, fleeing their homes perhaps because of violence, persecution, hunger. We have the situation for refugees around the world, and the United Nations says the following: the core principles of refugee protection are being put to a test, and it states the following statistics, that 167 countries have so far fully or partially closed their borders to contain the spread of the virus, and at least 57 states are making no exception for people seeking asylum. In your view, how can states manage border restrictions right now in ways that also respect international human rights and refugee protection standards, including through these quarantines and health checks that we have seen that have become so popular?
Sarah, what you're pointing out is an absolute problem. There are many governments that are closing their borders to virtually anybody, including people seeking asylum, including people who have a right to seek refuge because they're fleeing violence or persecution. And that is a problem we're seeing around the world. There are alternatives that would respect both the right to asylum and the right to public health. And that would be, for example, testing people as they come across the border, simple as that. And if they test positive, quarantining them for a period of time. But, the way Trump is doing is just sending everybody off to Mexico regardless, is not respecting any right to asylum. It's a blatant violation of international refugee law.
The world's poorest also poised to be disproportionately affected. We have here from the World Food Program saying that the COVID-19 pandemic will see more than 250 million people suffering acute hunger by the end of the year. Where's the action?
I think that, this is a problem not simply in poor countries, which is what the World Food Program was highlighting, but it's also a problem, closer to home. Every country has its neglected, marginalized, disadvantaged communities, whether it's immigrants or people living in poverty. And there is a tendency on the part of governments to just, ignore those people.
If people can't afford the very basics, they're not going to be able to afford a vaccine. That is very clear. And therefore, I'd like to ask you, because there are calls for any coronavirus vaccine to be accessible for all. We have the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying that the treatments and vaccines should actually belong to the whole world, not individual countries or regions. When we look at the state of leadership that you highlighted in your last answer there, how should that be organized?
Well, ideally, this is something that the World Health Organization would supervise. I mean, Trump is in the process of attacking the WHO as a way of diverting attention from his own mismanagement of the crisis. But, if you look at, for example, what happens with, say polio or, other infectious diseases where there is a global effort to provide vaccination to everyone, we're going to need something like that for the coronavirus once a vaccine is available. And it's a matter, again, of self-interest because we may well vaccinate people in parts of the world, but if there are whole areas where the coronavirus flourishes, it's going to remain a threat. Because even in the West, you can't vaccinate everyone.
How realistic are multilateral approaches, though, Ken? I mean, if you're just a realist on this, because we have a U.S. president who is not a strong supporter of multilateral approaches or human rights efforts, for that matter. I'm looking at him, quitting the UN Human Rights Council of the United States. Also, a history of abandoning multilateral commitments. You mentioned pledges to defund the WHO. Also, the Paris Climate Accord that I'm thinking about. How damaging has it been on the international stage, the lack of U.S. leadership right now?
Yeah, I mean, look, Trump is a disaster on every front when it comes to enforcing international standards or commitment to international cooperation. So he's a lost cause, and at least through next November, that's what we have. It really shows the importance of leadership from European governments and other governments. I mean, at the UN Human Rights Council, for example, where Trump abandoned it because it criticized Israel too much in his view, we've seen a whole range of governments step forward. Not only the traditional Western supporters of human rights, but also a whole range of Latin American governments when it comes to, say, Venezuela, even Muslim majority states that have often kind of eschewed these kinds of issues have come to the fore to try to protect Rohingya Muslims from persecution in Myanmar. So I think there's recognition that everybody needs human rights. You can't just trust the United States to do it, especially under Trump. And so, you either abandon the field and go back to pre-World War II, where there were no international standards of this sort, or new leaders have to step forward. And fortunately, many new leaders have assumed the mantle of enforcing human rights, global standards, whether it's climate, health, or other urgent needs.
We've also seen leaders stepping forward when it comes to filling some of the gaps in this crisis. And I'd like to ask you for your take on that, because the country where this virus initiated, China, has offered leadership in an effort to stamp out the virus. How does this change the overall global power dynamics? If even democratic countries, for example, are counting on China for their next delivery of face masks, for example?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real double-edged thing. I mean, on the one hand, of course, whatever China can do to provide basic medical needs, so much the better. But the Chinese government, is not beyond them at all to use those kinds of necessities as a way of enforcing censorship. And you see this, for example, where there was a lot of media attention just recently to African immigrants in China who were facing persecution. And Chinese diplomats in Africa were running around telling governments, you either stop criticizing us or we're going to stop giving you aid. And that's classic behavior by Beijing. They're always trying to use their economic clout to stop criticism of them, to enforce their censors' will around the world. And the only way to fight back against that is through the safety of numbers. If governments band together and say, no, we're not going to stop talking about the detention of 1 million Muslims in Xinjiang. No, we're not going to stop talking about what happened in Wuhan. We're not going to protest.
But we couldn't even see, Ken, I mean, the EU couldn't even face up to China. I mean, we saw recently, in the past week, it came to light the fact that the EU edited a report on disinformation in China in favor of preserving its trade ties.
Yeah, no, and that was hugely disappointing. And we've seen the European Union, for example, they did band together twice now, once at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, once at the UN General Assembly in New York, to condemn China's detention of 1 million Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. So it's doable. But this time around, when it came to saying, why is Beijing locking up journalists who go to Wuhan to investigate what happened? Why are they refusing to allow any independent inquiry into the origins of the virus? The European Union allowed the Chinese censors to tell European leaders what they could say. I mean, that's ridiculous. And I hope we can get, more courageous adherence to principle on the part of European Union leaders than that.
Let's talk a little bit more about principle, Ken. Recently, you faced reports that you accepted a big donation from a billionaire businessman from Saudi Arabia, a country not exactly known for its emphasis on human rights. This was reportedly on the condition that you would not report on LGBT rights in the region. And your own organization, as it turns out, had earlier documented coercive labor practices at this particular firm. Tell us, you've returned the gift, you've apologized. What motivated you to accept this donation at all?
Yeah, actually, what you're describing there is not quite accurate. We did accept a gift from a Saudi donor on the condition that we not use his gift for LGBT rights in the region. But it was always understood that we would continue to use other funds to enforce LGBT rights in the region, and indeed did that extensively, including me personally. So, I mean, in retrospect, we shouldn't have even accepted a limitation on his gift because it was, understood retrospectively as an endorsement of his bigotry. And so, I apologize for that. But we never would have agreed to limit our actual work on LGBT rights. And indeed, we never did. We've had a vigorous program defending the rights of LGBT people throughout the Middle East, throughout that period. It never stopped and it never
But
would.
Ultimately, there was a condition in there in the initial memorandum that you signed back in 2012.
Yeah, there was a condition on his money. He wanted his money to go
to not be. So if China comes to you, Ken, and says to you, I'm going to give you $5 million and I don't want you to report on the human rights abuses in China, are you willing to accept that? I mean, what's your price?
Yeah, first, we should be clear. We don't take any government money at all. This was an individual donor, and we don't preclude donations from individuals just because they happen to be Saudi or anything else. We take no government money. But what we've done now is made clear that, while we do accept gifts to say, here's money to promote women's rights or here's money to promote rights in Africa, we will not, as a matter of principle anymore, accept any gift that is limited that says you cannot report on, X type of victims.
Okay.
As far as we know, that's the only time we ever did that, and we would never do it again.
So you've changed the policy, but ultimately, this memorandum of understanding was signed back in 2012, and now it's 8 years later. After the donation came to the public's attention, you've called it a deeply regrettable decision. Why did it take you so long to take action?
Well, it actually only came to light again recently because a disgruntled former employee of his reached out to us. And so, we'd forgotten about it, to be honest. I mean, it just wasn't on anybody's mind. Once we were contacted again, we recognized that it's something we shouldn't have done, and we disclosed it and returned the gift and made clear that we would not accept such an exclusionary condition on any gift. As I said, this, I think, is the only time we've ever done that, and we'll never do it again.
Okay. I want to ask you about challenging situations around the world because Israel recently became the first democracy to expel a Human Rights Watch employee over his alleged call of a boycott of the country over its settlements in the occupied West Bank. Also in January, you were barred from entering Hong Kong for a news conference spotlighting Beijing's deepening assault on international efforts to uphold human rights. How do you have a positive impact in countries that accuse you of bias or won't allow you to work there? How do you change your methods?
Well, first, each of those cases totally backfired on the part of the government. So the Chinese government blocked me from holding a press conference in Hong Kong, releasing our annual world report, where we spotlighted China's efforts to undermine the global human rights system. And their blocking me ended up being Exhibit A. We got massive media attention when they blocked me. And 2 days later, I held the press conference at the United Nations in New York and got massive attention again. So they totally shot themselves in the foot. Similarly with Israel, Human Rights Watch has never endorsed a boycott of Israel, but the reason they expelled our researcher was because he had been instrumental in highlighting Israel's illegal settlements in the West Bank, and particularly the companies that are making those settlements possible by providing services and the like. And they basically called on those companies to live up to their human rights responsibility, not to be complicit in these war crimes. So again, they expelled him, massive media attention, more people focused on the problem than had ever been the case before. Now, your question, though, how do we operate? We've dealt with governments for many, many years where we can't get in. They either block us or it's too dangerous or what have you. And these days, there are lots of ways to still get information. Electronic means, obviously, through just telephone, email, social media, and the like. But we also increasingly are using, remote sensing. So we have a partnership with a satellite company where we can actually get a picture of any place in the world every single day. That allows us to see a lot. We do a lot on open source research. So people post images, video, and the like on social media, we can put it together and help to reconstruct events. So
Okay.
there are lots of ways you can follow what's going on, even if you can't physically be there.
But ultimately, Ken, and just briefly, I'd like to ask you, do you ever despair that the positive changes that you're hoping to effect in the world are as elusive as ever?
Look, my view of this is that governments, by their nature, are tempted to violate human rights. It's in their nature to try to do what promotes their political interests, even at the expense of people's rights. Our job at Human Rights Watch is to raise the cost of that happening. It doesn't mean it never happens, but it becomes more costly. And ultimately, this is a cost-benefit analysis. And if we can raise the cost enough by shining a spotlight of stigma on what they're doing, by enlisting the support of sympathetic governments, we can tip that balance and make it just not worth it to violate human rights. And that's when we make progress. And we see that kind of progress every single day through our work.
Kenneth Roth, thank you for joining us on Conflict Zone.
Thank you.